in the 1780s. By the early 1810s, the idea of a cohesive Western Hemisphere was bolstered by a growing web of political, economic, and cultural realities. In the beginning, there was trade. Ships cut doggedly through the Atlantic, their sails dotting the otherwise monotonous oceanic horizon. Spain tried to stop them from crossing imperial lines, determined that the fabled wealth of the Indies should stay in Spanish hands rather than bleeding out to the godforsaken English or eventually their conniving U.S. progeny. But the thirst for profit knows few national bounds. Where money was to be made, men in all empires sidestepped regulations. Commercial restrictions slowed the trade, but couldn't stop it. As one Connecticut merchant put it, men learned to do business in the smuggling way, while pirates and sea dogs, with their booty and their bluster, did business in the violent way. Goods and people trickled stealthily between empires, grains, fish, and other edibles from North America, sugar, coffee, cacao, and precious metals from Spanish America, African slaves all around. When the United States arrived on the scene, its traders also became eager re-exporters of European manufactures, spreading foreign-made goods around the Atlantic Rim and, increasingly, beyond. Occasionally, trade between the Anglophone and Iberian worlds operated more openly. In times of war, Spain periodically bowed to necessity by opening its American ports to neutral traders, fearing that its colonists might otherwise perish or revolt out of starving desperation. By 1797, Spain had grown so embroiled in European conflicts that it intermittently tolerated neutral trade for the better part of a decade. U.S. merchants happily offered their services, and within just 5 years of the new policy's implementation, trade with Spanish America had multiplied by a factor of 4. Business quickened to such a degree that the modern U.S. dollar sign seems to have evolved in this period out of the shorthand for peso, P with an exponent S, which looked increasingly like today's dollar sign, as merchants began to superimpose the P and the S. Most of that growing trade was with nearby Cuba, where sugar, coffee, and slavery were symbiotically booming after the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue slowed production in what had so recently been the world's leading producer. U.S. consumers wanted sweets, and U.S. merchants wanted gold and silver specie, while Cubans depended on U.S. flour and other foodstuffs lest they starve to death amid their sprawling fields of coffee and cane. Cubans also imported New England ice and snow, boatloads of the harrowing northern winter shoveled south to mitigate Cuba's endless summer. Meanwhile, despite state and federal laws that forbade U.S. citizens from trafficking in enslaved Africans outside the United States, U.S. merchants, most of them from North and Mid-Atlantic, did exactly that. In the first decade of the 19th century, U.S. citizens delivered some 25,000 Africans to stoke Cuba's surging economy. It was sordid, but it was lucrative, enough to inure men to the ugliness of the enterprise. Taken together, in fact, the Cuba trade buoyed the U.S. economy at a formative moment. Spanish-American specie monetized U.S. banks at home and balanced out trade deficits abroad, and all the while, merchants and traders reinvested their winnings in domestic industry, banks, and infrastructure, a massive economic multiplier effect rooted in offshore chattel slavery. Cuba was never the sole Spanish-American destination for U.S. ships, however, and by the early 19th century, traders and sailors were venturing further afield. Some looked across the Caribbean to Venezuela, contracting with Spanish colonial officials to supply food, weapons, and other supplies that helped to sustain the empire at a time of disorder and scarcity. Others looked to regions still more remote, sailing around Brazil and Cape Horn to the Pacific coast of Chile. There they killed blubbery mammals on an astonishing scale, harpooning whales and sea elephants until the water and rocks turned red. They killed seals, too, hundreds at a time, forcing the helpless creatures